One of the experiences I trust every homebrewer shares is the feeling of awe that comes from witnessing the conversion of wort into beer through the fermentation process. Even after 15 years, I still get giddy when I see the first signs of airlock activity, a nice fluffy kreuzen developing on top of my beer. The worst is when this takes too long. You all know the anxiety that comes from checking on a batch a day after pitching and seeing no action. This is why we love Imperial Yeast, who pack 200 billion cells of the purest yeast into each pitch-right pouch, which assures quick starts, healthy fermentation, and predictably great results. I strongly urge all of our listeners to check out everything Imperial Yeast has to offer and let them know that you appreciate their support of the Brülosophy podcast while you're at it. All right, on to the show. Hey everybody, welcome to the 210th episode of the Brülosophy podcast. I am your host, Marshall Schott, and I'm excited to be here for what will be our last Brü A episode of 2021. It is absolutely crazy to me that we're already approaching the end of this second odd year due to all the COVID stuff, but we made it. Joining me to answer listener-submitted questions is contributor Andy Carter.
Hey, Marshall. Yeah, I'm excited to get into these questions. You know, we always do our own experiments and read out and think about how we interpret things and look back. And now to have fresh questions, fresh data, I just love this. It's a fantastic experience and happy to answer these questions. It'd be great. Yeah,
without a doubt, we get more and more questions submitted between each of these Brü A episodes, which we publish. Every 10th episode is a Brü A episode. While we don't have the time to answer them all in a single episode, those who have submitted questions can rest assured that they are going to be added to our list to get addressed in a future episode. If you have a question, you can shoot it to feedback@brülosophy.com. Just make sure to put in the subject line that it's for Brü A. Otherwise, I might just respond to the email, or one of us might just respond to your email. But if you want it included on a Brü A episode, which we would love to do, just make sure you put that in the subject line. All right. If you like what we're up to and you want us to keep doing it, please consider becoming a patron of Brülosophy. This is very important for us to keep doing what we do. By committing to a rather small monthly pledge over at patreon.com/Brülosophy, you're going to receive a reward every month, like access to an unpublished recipe, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invite to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. Coming up later this month, Dr. Matt Winans from Imperial Yeast will be taking questions from patrons. Matt is beyond passionate about yeast and all of the other microbes we use to make beer, and his willingness to share what he knows is so appreciated. If you may be familiar with Matt because he was on a recent episode of the Brew Lab where Kate interviewed him about novel hybrid yeast strains. Very, very cool stuff. If you want to be a part of this session, you have to make your pledge over at patreon.com/Brülosophy by November 26, 2021, as Matt's going to be taking those questions on Saturday, November 27th. And all past sessions are stored on our private Facebook page, so patrons can go back and watch them whenever they like. We've got past guests have been Vinny Chilurzo from Russian River, John Kimmich from The Alchemist, and so many more. Another really easy way to support us is by using the links found at brülosophy.com/support when you're doing your shopping online. Your shopping experience doesn't change at all, and we get a little kickback for the referral. With the holiday shopping season upon us, we would seriously appreciate you taking the time to use those links. Bookmark them if you're cool with that, as it helps us to cover the costs of running this show and the website. Finally, if you wouldn't mind leaving a rating and review of this show in Apple Podcast or wherever it is you listen to podcasts, that would be awesome. Not only do we value knowing what you think about us, but those reviews help people who haven't heard of us to find the show. Feedback is brought to you by Brewers Hardware, who specialize in triclover compatible sanitary fittings, conical fermenters, kettles, and brew stands. Brewers Hardware offers a variety of unique items for home and craft brewers, including high-quality stainless fittings at great prices with super fast shipping. Learn more at brewershardware.com, and don't forget to mention Brülosophy at checkout to receive a free gift. That's brewershardware.com. Dustin Hogg from Minneapolis, Minnesota had some feedback regarding cold side oxidation in New England IPA. Dustin says, you guys often discuss the purple color New England IPA takes on from oxidation. The larger percentages of oats and wheat used in these beers are often higher in manganese than regular barley malt. When this element oxidizes, it can form, I hope I say this right, permanganate ions, which are brilliantly purple even in very low concentrations. I found the slides from a presentation by Ruth Martin at the Craft Brewers Conference of 2015 that mentions the benefits of manganese and the drawbacks such as oxidation, but it's been difficult to find much else. It could be a total wackadoodle idea, or maybe Cade has encountered some more esoteric information in his research for the Brew Lab that would shed some light on the subject. If so, I'd love to learn more.
Yeah, so this is actually a common issue with hazy IPAs because they just take on color so rapidly. Usually a darker color. But actually, my experience here is I had a beer. It was a wild ale, mixed fermentation beer that I just didn't add enough yeast, fresh yeast to, or the yeast didn't want to ferment because of maybe acid shock or something. And I swear that beer turned exactly purple. I mean, it was purple. But over the course of 6-8 months, the beer finally kind of became blonde again, which I thought was very interesting.
That is weird. Yeah.
And I reached out to Charlie Banforth, the main man. He didn't have very specifics, but he said, yeast will always consume oxygen in any form. So it made me think, these compounds, they're going one direction, right? Usually they go that way, right? They don't go backwards. So whatever is going on to make the beer change color and then spontaneously go back to looking like beer, it's much more complicated than we lead on. But to his point, there's this manganese compounds and stuff that are on adjuncts that are also in a lot of hazy IPAs. That's the wheat or it's the oats. And maybe that has a competition, right? There's these wild ales I make always have a ton of wheat in them. So it must be related. So, but we're still looking at this, and like a lot of these things that come out, a few data points here or there, then someone writes a paper and does some more analysis, and we're going to know about it. We're going to figure this out. So
yeah, so I definitely have experienced the cold side oxidation, the negative effects of cold side oxidation on hazy IPA. I've done experiments on this, in fact, that have shown readily that oxygen exposure to a hazy IPA will absolutely make it change color and taste like crap, in my opinion. Yes. So I've also experienced this on standard clear American IPA. In fact, back, I believe it was 2016 or 17, I was going to have Jersey come and brew his own beer, and then we were going to have Tim brew a beer and then make something fun out of that. That didn't end up happening, but Jersey did brew his, and it was a single hop. He likes really hoppy IPA, so it was this single hop IPA that we're making, and it was beautiful when we kegged it. It was nice and clear, and then we bottled, I think, 6 off and took them to an event with us, and literally 2 days in the bottle, and we poured one out, and it was purple. So This isn't just an issue with at least in my experience, it's not just an issue with New England IPA, but what Dustin's saying makes sense to me. In fact, prior to publishing his incredible book, The New IPA, Scott Janish and I were chatting about this color-changing phenomenon. He actually mentioned the manganese idea to me. Same thing that Dustin said, that wheat and oats, which are very commonly used in New England IPA, have higher levels of manganese. So, nerd that I am, I ended up buying some 100% pure manganese liquid supplement drops from Amazon to play around with. And I started by pouring 2 samples of the same volume of a non-oxidized, very clear American IPA that I had on tap at the time into identical glasses. So I filled them with the identical volume, exact same glasses. I just wanted to keep things as basic as possible. This was just something I was doing on the side. I then added what amounted to 10 milligrams of manganese to one of them, which is way more, I believe, than what they're saying is present in these New England IPAs. I could be wrong on that, but 10 milligrams, which I think was 5 drops. After which both were covered with foil, and then they were left in my garage. It was the winter time, so the temp was about 65, 66 degrees Fahrenheit, which is like 19 C at the time. And I just let them sit there, and I would go check on them, like twice a day. My thinking was that since both were ostensibly exposed to the same amount of oxygen during the pouring process, that one of them, or at least the one with the manganese, ought to turn purple if that is what is causing these beers to turn purple. However, and I'm telling you, I checked these things multiple times. The one with the manganese changed color, so did the one without it, and they did it at the same exact rate. I think it took 3 days before I started to notice any real color change, but it was the same in both beers. And it wasn't necessarily that one was that purple color that we associate with an oxidized hazy IPA. It's just that they got darker, which we know oxygen darkens things.
Absolutely.
So yeah. I don't know if it's the manganese. I think it's a valid theory, but there's a lot of research to be done in what is exactly happening with this cold side oxidation crap and hazy IPA, because it ruins those beers, at least to me.
Yeah. I mean, and as we've experienced with our own brewlosophy work, looking at the sulfites and kegging to try to, to scrub the last little bit of oxygen out of everything, right? And that seems to be working correctly, or working well enough that it's fixing some issues, or fixing those kind of long-term issues. So yeah, we'll see. We're going to keep working on it.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. So thank you for the feedback, Dustin. I remain fascinated by how sensitive hoppy beers, especially the hazy IPAs, are to oxygen. If you have show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com. brewlosophy.com or leave us a note on social media. This may surprise some folks out there, but I rather enjoy beers made with hot peppers. I mean, I would never order a pint or brew a full batch myself, but as someone who really likes heat, I think they're fun to sample, you know? Well, local home brewer and listener Brad Jennings left me a bottle of his Afterburner Kolsch, which I already shared with my friends once. If you've listened to the episode where we said farewell to Jersey, we did sample it there, but I figured I'd share it with a couple of my friends again.
1 minute beer review with Justin and Tim.
This one's a pretty one.
Tim,
Look at that.
she's
Look,
pretty.
I could definitely see your forehead.
Yeah, you do. Oh, hey, I could see my forehead.
Get a little pepper on the smell.
I'm not smelling the pepper, but that doesn't mean anything.
Oh, what are you tasting?
Oh, it's spicy on the back end.
See?
Boy, it's super peppery. It's pretty good.
It is good.
This would cut through the richness of like a pulled pork Sammy.
It's got like the heat of pepper I'm still getting it on the end. It's burning my back of my throat.
Yeah, it's 100% on the back end on your, is it your uvula? This is good. I don't know if I'd want to drink a whole lot
I'm
of it.
thinking we got a little habanero going on.
There is a pepper that is not pepper burning through this, that's for sure.
It's like a habanero.
It's jalapeno. At the minimum, it's jalapeno on the low end.
It's good though.
I'm gonna go with you. It's probably some type of habanero,
But it doesn't ruin it. It's a good taste.
no, it's not like, oh, hey, I have a gallon of beer and let me dump 57 jalapenos or habaneros in here to ruin it. It's a good flavor.
Yeah.
Good color, good head.
I'm going with like a 7.
7.
Bam.
Oh, Jersey who? This is a 7. This is a 7 Timmy J's.
I really feel like Brad did a good job on this beer. It was clean with bready malt flavor, just a subtle heat that kind of grew over time. If you couldn't tell with the guys, I think when they took the first sip, they just thought it was a good beer. And then over their 1 minute review, you could tell that they were starting to pick up more pepper. It was the pepper flavor, and then it left just a residual heat, but it was not hot. To me, that's kind of what I'm looking for. This was a pepper beer that I probably would order a full pint of. Brad, great job on this beer, man. Absolutely delicious. As far as I believe it was made with habanero. Very good.
I mean, it's cool to see that because, you know, you'd think, oh, pepper beer, then you're just going to get smoked out and then you're going to want to drink any more of it. And that turns into this, you know, discussions we've had in the past about dessert beers and having only 4 or 2 ounces. It's just that experience, right? The 1 minute beer review is perfect for those because you're only going to have about a minute to drink it and they're going to go to something else. Really cool to see someone come up with a way of doing the flavor and not the heat or as much heat. And I think it's a testament to the beer because those guys were very descriptive in the entire beer process. And it's hard unless the beer is providing you that thing to talk about. So very cool.
Yeah, and just another thing about pepper beers that I wanted to comment on is that a lot of times, I mean, you'll hear people say things like, "Oh, I had this stout that tastes like bell pepper." That to me is not a flavor I like in any beer. And I think one of the smart moves if you are going to make a pepper beer is to use peppers that don't taste like bell pepper, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yes,
And habaneros don't. Habaneros have this real fruity flavor. You know, if you can handle the heat and get past that. It's got this sweet, fruity flavor that I really love. I love habanero. And so I think it's just an absolutely ideal pepper to use if you're into making these hot pepper beers. And Brad did a great job. So, kudos to Brad on that one. So if you want your beer or any other fermented beverage reviewed by Justin and Tim, you can email me, marshall@brewlosophy.com, and we will get you all set up. When we return from this break, answers to your questions. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com. And be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you.
Compact and simple to use with a small footprint for brewing indoors, the Grainfather makes it easy for you to brew professional quality beers at home. The Grainfather is an all-in-one brewing system that lets you brew all-grain beer in a single, compact stainless steel unit. It uses an electric heating element and pump to maintain a constant temperature and to circulate the wort during the mashing and cooling stages. It also comes with a counterflow chiller to reduce chilling times and produce high-quality wort. And now, with the addition of their conical fermenter, the Grainfather takes things one step further by offering homebrewers state-of-the-art temperature-controlled fermentation just like commercial breweries use. And with the Grainfather Recipe Creator and Connect app, you can easily design a recipe, sync your brewing system with your phone, and then just sit back and relax as the app takes over and assures that you maintain your scheduled mash temps and boil schedule. Head to grainfather.com to purchase your all-in-one brewing system today and to sign up for their free recipe creator tool. Once more, head on over to grainfather.com, that's grainfather.com, and get started today.
Family-owned Atlantic Brew Supply is the largest homebrew shop in the Southeast. No gimmicks, no multinational corporate overlords, and no BS. They offer exclusive malts, yeast, and more from local artisans, as well as award-winning recipe kits. They also sell professional brewing gear and cask equipment from sister companies ABS Commercial and Cask Supply. Most ingredients are available by the ounce, plus Atlantic Brew Supply has an on-site calculator to help you craft your best brew. Orders are processed same day, and 2-day shipping is guaranteed for East Coast customers. Get 15% off your first order using promo code BREWPOD, that's BRUPOD, at AtlanticBrewSupply.com. Craftmaster Growlers takes traveling with and sharing beer to a new level. Made from heavy-duty stainless steel, Craftmaster Growlers are double-wall insulated and can keep beer cold for up to 8 hours. Unlike typical growlers, Craftmaster Growlers come with a swiveling tap and fully integrated CO2 regulator cap, allowing beer to stay fresh for 2 weeks or more. The square design takes up less space and will fit in most refrigerator doors, and every Craftmaster Growler comes with a 1-year warranty. There are 64 and 128-ounce versions available over at craftmastergrowlers.com. Huge thanks to everyone who has submitted questions. It's what makes this series possible, and we continue to get a ton of them. Again, if your question does not get addressed in this episode, it is on our list and will be answered in a future Brü A. All right, first question comes from Tom Waddington from Denmark. And he had a question after listening to episode 187 where we talked about using stainless mesh filters. Tom says, hop spiders. I use one and found the episode interesting, though one question remains in my mind that I cannot find an answer to. If the boil is complete and I remove the hop spider with all of the hop material, will bitterness levels increase while the wort is at a high temperature? Does removing the hop material prevent further isomerization, or are the hop oils present in the wort undergoing further isomerization and increasing bitterness?
This is a great question because it made me really think about how to think about the liquid and the mort and the green matter. And, so first of all, if you look at calculators that calculate bitterness, they tend to peak out after 60 minutes or so. You're not going to extract more. So the question is it fully extracted, or is there something left in there to extract? And so I think there's kind of both. If you take the spent hops out of the late, say you could isolate just the late edition hops, right? You can use those and put those back in another beer to get more bitterness, right? You can use dry hops as a bittering hop even if you really wanted to, because the bitterness is still there. So I would imagine you remove the bag, you're going to lose some of that bitterness, but that's only during chilling, right? Because if you chill, you go to zero minutes, you're done, you knock out, right? Depending on how you set up your chilling rig, either it's immersion chiller or counterflow or something like that, the beer is going to sit for a non-zero amount of time hot with the hops. So there's something going on there that you're missing, either flavor or bitterness or something like that. I mean, to point, there's a process of hop bursting, right? Where you add a ton of hops right as it's chilling and then let it kind of simmer there a little bit, below 200 Fahrenheit to add more flavor. So I would say you just be consistent with your process. And if you don't like the amount of flavor, either it's too much or too little, well, then remove them, right? Getting them out is the simplest way to do that. To me, this sounds like a great experiment because we can then kind of show if I make the same beer and pull the bag at 0 minutes left of the boil versus not and let it sit for 10 or 20 minutes as it's chilling, what kind of flavor impact it has would be very interesting.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to comment on as well, is I really think there are hop scientists out there, of which we are not, who likely know the answer to this, a hard answer to this. But I think what Tom's getting at is if I take those hops out, which a lot of people do so that they can fit their chiller into their wort, right, into their kettle, if I take those out, am I losing something? something because traditionally those hops just kind of stay in the beer or stay in the wort. And so if you take them out, it's something that I've thought about as well. Well, I think a good experiment would be you make a very simple, say, blonde ale that just has a single bittering addition and bitter it up to something like 35 or 40 IBU predicted. And then in one of them at the end, you take the hops out, keep them both in a spider to keep that part of it, equal. But then at the end of one, you take the hop spider out. And then the other one, they stay in while you chill. Does it change something? My understanding about how hops work in wort is that, particularly for those 60-minute additions, is that you are, in essence, you are pulling those alpha acids, which is where bitterness primarily comes from. We're not going to get into the weeds on bitterness here. But that they are being extracted from that vegetal matter and are now floating in that wort. They are in there, and the isomerization then occurs, and you've got these isoalpha acids. So I would think that you're not going to see much of a difference. But again, from a sensory perspective, I think the best thing we can do is test it out, and that's a great idea for a future experiment. So thanks for the question, Tom. Hopefully that answers it. I know we're not being we're not providing a hard answer, but I have a lot of friends who remove their hops at the end of their boil, and they're not struggling with bitterness issues. So there's that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think in the end, it's your system. You got to be consistent and then alter your recipe to meet your system. That's I think the best way. So next question comes from Michael Gidone. Do you guys think oxidation is mostly from the organic compounds from the dry hops in general, or just the organic matter like an apple oxidizes on a counter and goes bad? What about adding potassium sorbate like in cider or juice? Could that prevent or slow down oxidation of a heavily dry hop beer?
That is a potassium sorbate is one that we don't talk about often. I use it in my cider making as well as a means of knocking the yeast out, right? So it doesn't ferment when I add juice back or when I add fruit back to it. To back sweeten, right? But so again, our understanding of the whole cold side oxidation process, we have a decent idea of what's going on. I don't understand the why behind it necessarily. It could be this manganese thing, as we've talked about. It could be something else. It is interesting to me that cold side oxidation, which we get this out there, it happens to every beer. It just seems that certain beers are even more sensitive to it and show the negative effects on a bigger scale, right? So New England IPA is the obvious beer style that you absolutely will notice cold side oxidation in. What is it? I'm not exactly sure. Do I think it's organic material like an apple oxidizes? I do think that it's the same process, right? I think we're pretty certain that that's why it happens. Oxidation just happens. But what is it that's oxidizing? I don't really know. I am curious though. We've done experiments on sodium metabisulfite, which is another preservative that is used in the wine and cider making worlds. Sulfites, right? Some people are allergic, so be careful. But yeah, we've shown that is one way to reduce the impact of oxygen exposure is if you add sulfites. So would adding potassium sorbate help as well? Maybe. I'm not sure how sorbate works or if it, any different than sulfites, but it makes sense to me that it would or that it might. And so again, yet another good idea for a future experiment.
Yeah, and I think I agree. A lot of more I hear about sorbates is to arrest a fermentation, right? One popular one, I know some professional brewers, you're adding more adjuncts to your finished packaged beer.
That's right.
You do not want a re-fermentation. So sorbates is a tool. It's a technique. It's one of many techniques to, unlike a pasteurization or something that could modify the beer's flavor greatly. You can just add this with the right amount of whatever sweet adjunct or whatever fermentable adjunct you'd be adding to your beer, so you would stop fermentation and hopefully not have a problem on your hands inside the package. So is it going to add? I believe sorbates do absorb some amount of oxygen. I don't know how effective they are, and the question will be, if we go down this road further, is how much do you have to add to get the effect you want, right?
Yeah.
When we add sulfites to beer, it's in such limited fractions, parts per billion, 10 parts per million, right? So there's no flavor. We minimize flavor. Now, that seems to arrest oxidation. It gives oxygen a weight up somewhere to go rather than go into the beer. It goes to the sulfite first. Now, if you have to add a lot more sorbate, now you might taste the sorbate, and then that would alter the beer too much, and that would be bad, right? So there's something going on there, and it's a cool thing to think about.
Yeah. We make the mistake often enough ourselves, and thankfully you and I haven't made it yet, Andy. But there is a different. I know people are hearing us talk about sulfite right now, and maybe thinking gypsum, which is calcium sulfate. We got to be careful with that. Sulfite and sulfate, very different. Yes. Sulfite is not. You're not going to add that to increase the hop presence in an IPA. You want sulfates for that, and that comes in the form of gypsum or magnesium sulfate, also known as Epsom salt. So we are talking specifically about these preservatives that I think it's interesting. Is they're widely used in winemaking of any sort of wine, so cider, mead, grape wine. But for some reason, it is like massively taboo to even consider a commercial brewery using it. And I was talking with some friends of mine who brew commercially, and they were saying it's not that they're necessarily against it. They think it could be helpful, particularly with all of these high adjunct fruit beers that are popular right now. They think it's because people don't want to read that there's sulfate in their beer. I mean, that it's a perception thing, right?
Yes. Yeah. I'm 100% there. If you eat ice cream, if you eat other packaged goods, you've added sorbates, right? So it is a barrier, much like GMO yeast is to brewing today, is that this is a barrier to the customer and not necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think the reason I wanted to bring that up is I think that potassium and or sodium metabisulfite, not necessarily sorbate, which I know is what Michael's asking about here, but I think he was being more general, I think it is an underutilized tool. Make sure that you're not allergic to it. If there are people out there that you know who get headaches when they drink red wine or white wine, then maybe let them know before they have your beer. But my goodness, to be able to, one, reduce the risk of oxidation, cold side oxidation, while also being able to kind of ensure that yeast isn't going to do anything in the package, I think that's a huge benefit. So I say that, but I've never used the sulfites that I have in my garage. I have both sodium and potassium metabisulfite. I've never used those in a beer. I reserve them primarily for cider, but I absolutely see them as being could be a good tool to have in your tool belt as a brewer. So
I would warn everyone, the sulfites, the powders, you'll start sneezing a lot. Of anything you're using in your brewery, I mean, we don't talk about this too much about safety and stuff, but these acids we use, then undiluted star sand. But I would say very specifically, if you've not used potassium or sodium metabisulfite before, just be very careful with that powder, put it that way. So
yeah, I made the mistake of I bought a big, I think it was a 1 pound bag from More Beer of potassium metabisulfite, which if you're just using it on cider, you'll have that for the rest of your life. It's a lot of it's a lot of sulfite. But I made the mistake of kind of opening it too quickly, and the dust poofed up into my face, and I thought I was having an asthma attack. I mean, it really is powerful stuff. So
powerful stuff.
All right, next question comes from Jared Bradley from 7 Mile, Ohio. Jared says, I wanted to brew a beer to share with my fantasy football league at our draft. I made a Deschutes Mirror Pond Pale Ale recipe about 2 weeks before the draft, so I would have to turn it around quickly. My normal routine is to close transfer to the keg once fermentation slows, and then let it finish in the keg before crashing and force carbing it. I transferred at day 6, left it at 70 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 21 C, and then I left it at 70 degrees Fahrenheit to finish up until day 10, and checked the gravity a few times to make sure the final gravity was reached. I tasted the sample and thought it might have tasted a bit young, so I left it for another few days. Then I crashed it and carbed it quickly to try to have it drinkable for our draft. But when I pulled a carb sample, it still tasted like what I assume was acetaldehyde. I decided not to take it. I still want to try to fix it though. So my question is, how? Bring it back up to fermentation temps for another week or so and hope the yeast is will still feel like cleaning it up? Spin up a starter and pitch active yeast and try to clean it up? Something else? Thanks in advance. I love the show on the website. Well, we love your question, Jared.
So it's super interesting to talk about this because I remember very early on in my brewing, I would have bouts of diacetyl or acetaldehyde, and a lot of common ones is just to add more yeast. And unfortunately, that could work, but it's not a foolproof technique.
Yeah.
Last week we talked about the yeast, yeast in general, right? And part of that process, that anaerobic fermentation, is to go from glucose or maltose to pyruvate to acetaldehyde to ethanol. And it's possible to go back from ethanol to acetaldehyde. There's enzymes within the yeast that convert these things back and forth. And so one of two things that's happening. One is you didn't convert all the acetaldehyde to ethanol along its path, right? You essentially restricted fermentation, right? You left without acetaldehyde, or oxygen getting into the ethanol could actually go back to acetaldehyde.
Yeah.
And then the yeast didn't have a chance to clean it up. So is there full? I think everything he says, can we do this? Can we do this? Can we do this? These are all things to try. I would say, the most one that makes the most sense in my opinion is another starter, a active starter to add to your beer and see if that works. And unfortunately, there is really no good technique. I will say we have been looking at this. A friend of mine had a similar issue, and we were thinking about this more. And I brought it to people at work because there's something called ALDC, which has become more popular for beer people that produce hazy IPAs. It's actually an enzyme that will convert diacetyl to either its precursors or its postcursors during fermentation, but you have to add it pre-fermentation. It's a little booster shot for the yeast to prevent any diacetyl formation long term in the beer. Is this possibly something we could do for acetaldehyde? Can we do it post-fermentation? I'm looking at it. Again, not a microbiologist, but it's something to think about. Is how do we fix this? And why I bring it up is the acetaldehyde. I mentioned it can happen from oxidation. I've had a string of beers within the homebrew club that were barrel-aged beers, right? So these have a lot more higher dollar value on them. We do not want these to fail. And we'll find a few of those barrels out of a group will have a lot of apple character, a lot of acetaldehyde. And so why is that? And it's open question. Is it from the barrel or is it from the beer going into the barrel? Stay tuned. We're looking at this right now.
That's interesting. The whole acetaldehyde thing to me is interesting because in my experience, I don't taste acetaldehyde, and I've done, I think, 3 now actual flavor samples, like with using the Flavor Active, their little pills that they have. And I've never tasted the whole green apple thing that people say they get with acetaldehyde. And I get where they're coming from. To me, though, it's more like what Cade says is like pumpkin, like raw pumpkin. And I just carved pumpkins with my family, recently for Halloween a couple weeks ago. And I'll tell you, that reminded me of the acetaldehyde that I smell in green beer. The thing is, my understanding is that you can get rid of it if it's there because it is, again, cursory understanding of microbiology. It is a precursor to ethanol. So if you do something like you use the term booster shot, which I think is a perfect analogy here, to boost that, you can push that acetaldehyde into going away in essence. Same thing with diacetyl or what you call diacetyl. I know that there's 2 ways to say the same thing, but it's the same idea. You can get rid of it. To me, this is more, I think the better approach is what do you do to make a beer quickly? And I think there are things that you can do, Jared, to make your beer, to turn a beer around quickly without even having those issues in the first place. The easiest one is if you have the ability, ramp your temp up a little bit warmer than you did. I mean, I will always ferment, almost all of my beers nowadays, but if I'm making an ale that I want to turn around really quickly, I'm going to pitch it at 66, ferment it at 66 for 2 days. That's it. And then I'll ramp it all the way up to 74, 75 degrees Fahrenheit. We're talking 23C or so, and it's going to finish out. Where what we know about yeast and off flavor production is that a large amount of those off flavors are produced during that those initial phases of fermentation, those first few days after you pitch the yeast. Well, if you're pitching healthy yeast into a wort that's ready to be fermented, which all wort is, and you manage that temperature properly, you can do a lot to avoid producing those, or to get past the production of those off flavors that you don't want in your beer. And then ramping it up, you're just favoring the yeast at that point. I believe all yeast favor like 95 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit, which is like 35 C-ish. It's just we don't do that because we're trying to keep them reined in so that they are predictable and produce the characteristics we want. But again, once you get past those initial phases of fermentation, you can raise that temperature up even warmer and really drive off that diacetyl and acetaldehyde.
Yeah. I think the other option here is something I always find these problems occur with certain yeast strains. You might want to change your yeast strain that might be a little faster. The other one to look at, and this is kind of is really going to get away from the process, but for fast beer, clean Kvike strains will ferment very quickly at very high temperatures and almost never leave flavors, these what I would call undesirable flavors rather than off flavors, just to distinguish the thing that an undesirable flavor might be fixable, right? You might be able to fix diacetyl, you might be able to fix acetaldehyde, but an off flavor like a phenolic or something like that is basically there and it's done, right? You're not going to get rid of it. So,
yeah. One more comment that I wanted to make. There is a company called AEB, and I've been talking to them. I would love to sponsor them, or for them to sponsor us, because they're producing some really cool chemical products for brewers. And I heard, little fly on the wall. I heard that they are going to be moving into the home brewing market soon. They are already offering these chemicals on the professional commercial scale. Users makers of it, Crow and Wolf, my friends over there, they use some of this stuff. They've got like drops that you can drop into a batch of beer if it has diacetyl that will kill the diacetyl in essence. It will take it away. They've got like carbon drops that you can use for your hard seltzers instead of having to add, powdered, whatever it is. It's like charcoal, basically, activated charcoal. They've got these drops you can just add, and it does the same thing. So go check them out. They are this. From what I heard, I went to a party a couple weeks ago with a representative from AEB, and we just hammed it up for about an hour because what she was telling me, all of these things they have, I really think, again, is just going to blow the minds of brewers out there. If all you have to do is open up an acetaldehyde bomb pale ale and put a couple drops of a completely natural chemical in it, and it goes away, that's amazing, right?
Yeah.
So just something to check out.
Next question from Dan. I started buying my grains in bulk, and I was wondering what the Brew Crew does. How do you store your grains? How long do those grains last? What kind of grains do you keep on hand? I know the last question depends on what types of beers you brew, but I'm curious what your grain storage looks like.
So when I moved into doing the whole bulk thing, which I absolutely advocate for, it means you can go brew whenever you want to and not have to worry about running to the homebrew shop. And you can still support your homebrew shop by buying your stuff from them. That's what I do. So when I moved into going into the bulk grain storage, I bought all the stuff that and by bought, I mean, I believed all of the stuff that I was reading online about you have to keep, malted grain is in an oxygen-free environment, and you don't want to leave it in the bag because yada yada, and you can, you're going to get stale grains. We have done so many experiments at this point, both short and shoddy and real comparative experiments that we do, showing that the way you store your grains really doesn't seem to have a huge impact on their flavor. I mean, I made a beer with like 4.5-year-old grain that was milled and sitting in a bag on my shelf in my garage that gets to like 100 degrees during the summer, and it was set there for 4 years, and it was fine. So I'm not convinced that the way you store it is going to impact flavor. However, it does make accessing those grains a lot easier if you use something like a 60-pound Vittles vault, which I have 4 of those. So I keep 4 base grains on hand all the time. And then I use I believe they're 5-gallon paint buckets that you can buy for $2 a pop at Lowe's. I use those for all of my specialty grains. You have to buy the tops separately. I think they're an extra $1, and they pop on really tight, so it'll keep little critters out. Mice like to find their way into grains because they taste good. So that's, to me, is the biggest concern, is making sure that bugs aren't going to get in there, cockroaches or whatever. So do that. But yeah, that's what I use. And I have shelves in my garage that I place those small buckets on, and I keep the Vittles vaults kind of some in a corner of my garage, and it's really easy to access. I have a little cart that I keep my mill on, and just move it over to the grain bins and fill her up and do that. So the grains that I like to keep on hand, I will always have pale malt. I'll always have a Pilsner malt, and currently that is Mecca Great Estate Malt, Pelton and La Manta. I always have a Vienna malt because I love Vienna malt as a base malt. I also love making Vienna lagers, and I think it works really well in pale as a small portion of pale lagers in general. And then I always like to have something else on hand. That might be a Munich malt, it might be a wheat malt, it might be rye. And so those are the base malts I'll keep on hand. In terms of I get this question a lot, so I kind of have I have like a template that I respond with. In terms of my specialty grains, I always have roasted barley. I always have, or I might have a chocolate malt in place of it, or black malt. I don't think they have that big of a difference in flavor. So, but I like to have something very dark. So I'll usually get like a dark roasted English roasted barley. I always have Crystal 60 and Crystal 10 or 15. Let's see what else. I like to have a little bit of honey malt on hand, and I like to have Victory or Biscuit malt on hand. Other than that, if I'm just buying smaller amounts of malt, let's say something like Special B, when I order it from More Beer, or when I run down and grab it from the local shop, they put it in a bag for me. I'll just roll the top of that bag down, put a clip over the top, and leave it on my shelf.
Sure. For me, I have a range of base malts because I find, again, bulk buy, that's the way to go. You have to buy the mill, but then you can start buying your grains, half price basically if you're buying bags, or better sometimes, depending on where you're getting them from. I think having the mill is great because then you can get your gauge depth in, and then you'd always grind the same way. You have to maintain the mill, of course. You have to take it apart, I would say, every few years to clean it, but you still got to do that. But then you have all your grains there. But for me, I keep the base malts, but I keep my specialty malts very low. I might have a couple that this local shop doesn't stock. Like I want some specific English malts, so I get those special ordered. I'll buy a 5 or 10 pound bag, and then just keep that wrapped up. And like Marshall said, we're not seeing an issue storing these hot as long as they're closed and my garage. It gets up to 100 degrees in the summer. It's down to 50 degrees in the winter. And I've not seen any impact, in terms of positive or negative. And, I'm leaving the base malts just out there, again, keeping things closed, keeping, any type of critters out of them. And and I think the one thing, if you read what people say online, the base malts seem to have a very good shelf life. And I'm turning beers over so quickly that I'm just buying new sacks of malt every few months, right?
Yeah.
So even my base malt is not just sitting around. But that's the question of, well, what is your specialty malt doing? And does it need to be fresh? What is the freshness argument there? And so I don't like to keep those around as much, just because I'm not brewing as spontaneously. I do have a pretty small pipeline, and I need to keep the pipeline moving. So I tend to just buy those specialty malts when I need them, as needed, and then go from there.
Yeah. See, I've got a garage, so and my wife has given me the third bay of it for all of my brewing crap. So I'm able to store that stuff in it. I also keep things like, I like to have torrefied rice, or it's basically just minute rice. I like to have that on hand for if I need to use that, or like flaked maize, all of that stuff. I just keep in the bag I get from the homebrew shop and put one of those like a binder clip over it or whatever.
Yeah.
So
no problem.
All right. The main thing, by the way, I wanted to mention this: if you're going to store your grains in bulk, make sure you keep them dry. I mean, that is a big issue.
Yeah.
You don't want moisture getting in there, anything like that. So that's just another thing, Dan, is the biggest issues are keep critters out and keep them dry. That's what I found matters more than this whole like, oh, they're going to oxidize. Now, I've never experienced anything like that, and you're usually using your grains more than quick enough. I'll go through a sack of pale ale or pale malt, in a matter of month and a half, 2 months. So
exactly,
you're using 10 pounds of that stuff on average per batch for a 5-gallon batch. So. Next question comes from James Cobbett, who lives in Panama. He says, I have a 2-barrel nano brewery. For now, due to convenience, I'm kegging with Cornies and generally produce 10 to 12 kegs per brew. The problem is I can't seem to find a cost-effective way of measuring the volume of the keg when it's being filled. This has led me to having to leave the top open during the filling so I can see the level inside, which obviously is not good since we're trying to minimize oxygen exposure. Essentially, this problem will be there for anyone who brews 10 gallons or more. So I'm sure others have come across this issue as well. Do you have any tips on how I can achieve the transfer without under or overfilling while leaving the purged kegs sealed?
Yes. So there's 2 ways to do this. There's, I would call the homebrew way to do it, and then there's the actual professional way to do it. So we'll cover both. So the homebrew way to do it is something we came up with a few years ago when we were emptying a 55-gallon wine barrel of sour beer, and we needed to put it into vessels to parse out to 5 gallons at a time to people. And I was like, okay, how are we going to know how much to give people? Because we couldn't give people exactly 5 gallons. We had to give them like 4 gallons, and then if there was extra, we would start parsing that out. And so the best way to do this is get a scale. So we would put the keg on a scale, tear the weight, start filling, and when we got to like say 35 pounds, we would fill the next keg. And then that way, at least you're giving it an accurate amount by pounds. Of course, it's not by gravity points, but beer is almost, when it's finished, it's almost water. So, is roughly the right number, right? It's within the percents. Fine. So you could do that. Now you still have to watch it, right? That doesn't really fix the problem, right? All you can say is, oh, I'm at 50 pounds. I think it's full. The real way to do it is something I saw at a professional brewery. You can buy an attachment that goes on your gas inside. And it's a little, it looks like this. I'll describe what it looks. I don't have the brand name, but basically it's a little pipe with a little plastic ball bearing in it. And as soon as beer hits that ball bearing, it forces the ball bearing up and shuts the flow of liquid out. It just stops there immediately. So you can have it open, it'll force the CO2 out of it, and as soon as the liquid hits it, it stops flowing, and that's it. Now your keg's full. And that's the professional way of doing it. Micromatic sells them, but now Duotite sells them too. So if you go on they make the quick disconnects in the fittings for the Duotite or John Guest type fittings. They sell a little kit that's this automated stopper, and it works. It's great.
Yeah, that was what I was going to say is the most efficient way, and it's actually not that expensive. So James, I would just recommend you buy that Duotite fitting. You're going to love it. The other thing, I have nothing to add to what you said. There is a little device out there that I saw a few years ago that relies on a tiny little magnetic ball that you throw this sanitized magnet into your keg, then you attach it to the side at the very bottom of your keg, right, with this tiny little ball. It's like an indicator ball that's orange. And then as you fill it, you watch this ball climb because it's a float. The magnet on the inside is a float. And it's just a really easy, simple mechanical way of knowing how much much, volume is in your keg. Very, very cheap. I think the guy was selling, you get like 4 of them for $20 or something. Again, this was like 7 or 8 years ago that I saw it. But I guarantee you, if that's not around, you could probably just make one with stuff magnets you've got lying around or can buy on Amazon. The weight thing, one of the arguments that somebody posed when I proposed doing weighing their kegs, which is very homebrew, is different gravities of beer are going to weigh different things. Well, then take a pint glass, tear your pint glass, fill that pint glass with the beer with exactly a pint, which you can measure out using a measuring cup if you want. Put that back on, and now you know how much that beer weighs, so you can actually calculate how many pints are in 5 gallons, which is what, 42, I think. And then 42 times however much that weighs, and you know exactly how much to fill your keg with. So it's not that difficult. But like you said, I'm on with the duo-tight thing. I think that's the most efficient way to do it. So.
Yeah, it's the right way to do it. That's how the professional way to do it. And the best part is, like he's saying, he's filling 10 to 12 kegs. He doesn't want to sit there all the time. He wants to start, maybe make a tea that splits off into 3. The 3 fill simultaneously. He can walk away from it, come back, and they're all filled, and then just do it again, right? That's how professionals do it.
Yep.
And that's what I would recommend.
Amen.
So,
Amen.
Next question from John Ferreira with a question about forced carbonating kegs. I've tried the 50 psi overnight method twice now, and both times I seem to get a strange acid bitterness in the beer. I feel like it's due to all the CO2 added so quickly. Has anyone else had experiences like this?
So back in the day, this would be referred to as carbonic bite. Do you recall that, Andy? People talking about carbonic bite?
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
So CO2 imparts carbonic acid into the beer. It's a part of what makes the crispness of the fizz. I don't know. I like that. I have never experienced this, and I wonder sometimes if, and I don't wonder, I know that when expectation is going to guide our perception often, if I'm doing something that's new to me, like forcing 50 psi of CO2 into beer overnight and then reducing that, my brain is going to expect something to be different. What do we often read about? If you've been around brewing for long enough, is this carbonic bite about overly, or too quickly carbonating your beer? Well, I'm going to tell you something. Most commercial breweries carbonate their beer this way. They're forcing high amounts of gas so that they can turn that beer out of their bright tank quicker, right? And get it into kegs or get it on tap. And so this is nothing new. If you're tasting that acid bitterness, come back to that beer 2 days later and see if you taste it still. It's gonna go away. I mean, that's just how carbonation works. And if your carbonation level is where you want it to be, and you've purged that keg of that high pressure, and that carbonation is carbonation. I mean, we know this. So I'm just not quite sure that strange acid bitterness is a function of the carbonation method. It may be that beer, or those beers maybe were highly bittered with hops or something. I don't know, but that's just been my experience. So.
Yeah, so I thought about this, and it called me back to something some more professional brewers were talking about, and it was an interesting problem because my background is engineering, and I had to take a class in fluid mechanics and and chemical engineering, and a lot of basically the chemical engineering is how well are things mixed, right? There's equilibrium and non-equilibrium reactions, and I'm wondering, talking to someone that fills like a 7 or a 10 barrel vessel, when they put PSI on, it's not like it's instantaneous, right? It needs time, it needs to diffuse and distribute. And I'm wondering if what he's tasting is a non-equilibrium reality of the beer in the keg.
Yeah.
And I think the keg needs to be mechanically moved. It's purged, right? So you should be able to shake it without ruining the beer, of course. But I would say, as I don't know if this is going to be an experiment or not, but just to say, if you're going to do 50 psi for 24 hours, I would take that keg and maybe flip it upside down and right side up again, just to make sure that the solution is homogeneous before calling it like anything. Because in the long run, in the equilibrium, the CO2 is the CO2.
Yeah.
So it's eventually going to reach whatever PSI it's going to reach. So, I think it's something about the distribution of the CO2 within the keg. That's my opinion.
That's interesting. I didn't mention it earlier, but I will mention it now that I think we've done 3 experiments on this, and they've all come back non-significant. So again, that's just more grist for that mill, if you will. I just don't think that that it's imparting any noticeable, acid bite or anything like that. So, well, we've got to get to our final break. We're going to be back with more Brü A after these messages. There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today. The Brew in a Bag method has blown up over the last few years, and in that time, it's become very clear that not all bags are created equal. For the best BIAB experience, you have got to go with the Brew Bag. Made from high-quality, food-safe polyester, the Brew Bag is available in both 210 micron for standard Brew in a Bag, as well as 400 micron, which works beautifully for all-in-one recirculating systems. I've been a Brew Bag user for years and wouldn't brew without it. Head over to brewinabag.com to get the fabric filter that works for you, and use promo code TBP17 at checkout to receive a discount. Again, that's brewinabag.com. Have you ever thought about adding a port to your kettle but held off because you didn't feel like drilling into your gear or sending it off to have someone else do it? From the makers of the world's fastest counterflow chiller, the Exchillerator, comes the Hangover, the easiest way to add extra ports to your kettle, as well as countless other options. Mount a faucet to your keg for easy portable pouring. Set up the perfect whirlpool arm. Hold a heating element in place. All of this and so much more without permanently modifying your gear. Manufactured right here in the United States, the Hangover offers brewers too many convenient solutions to list here. So head over to Exchillerator.com today to see what the Hangover can do for you. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer, and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. Alrighty, time to answer another set of listener-submitted questions. Andy, go ahead and kick us off.
Yeah. Bradley Jennings asks, when using CO2 from a fermenting beer to purge star sand out of a keg, have you ever used that purged keg on a different beer and noticed the scents and flavors from that beer when that was fermenting? I made a stout and attached the fermenter to a keg full of star sand to purge it. I then used that freshly purged keg for an American Pale Ale that was ready to be kegged. I'm getting subtle but noticeable hints of that vanilla and chocolate from the stout in my Pale Ale.
Okay, this is such a good question, and Bradley, you're in luck because Cade is collecting data for this experiment as we talk. So that is going to happen. This is something that I wondered about when I first started doing this method, which I know I didn't invent, but I'd never read about it when I came up with the idea to use naturally produced CO2 to purge the keg that the beer would then go into. My thinking was, well, I'm purging that keg with the beer with this gas from the beer that's going to end up going into the keg. So yeah, if it is imparting flavor, it's probably flavor that I want, right? It's the same as what the beer is. So I've never racked a beer into a keg that was purged from another beer, if you know, and I've also never purged a keg with a beer that had vanilla and chocolate in it. So who knows? What I can say, I know the answer, Bradley, is no. I have not experienced what you're talking about here. No flavor carryover that I could tell. It's always the beers just tasted like what I expected it to taste like. Now I have reused the same star sand purged from keg to keg to keg. I think I went 8 times once. And when I opened it, it was still crystal clear. It didn't look gross. It absolutely smelled like fermentation. But again, it had gone through 7 or 8 different beers, or beer cycles, if you will. So it had that kind of like, CO2 from fermentation smell, but it wasn't anything crazy. When I was pouring it out, I took a glass of it and just smelled it. And it just smelled like fermentation, but nothing notable, about any of the styles that I brewed prior. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I've not done the CO2 rack method as described. I just use CO2 tanks and everything, and I'd like to, if I had the space, I would do it and add more kegs. I think I'm always asking for more kegs. Can I get another keg in here somewhere? But what I do notice is I'll clean. Say I have a really hoppy, like real ripping hazy IPA, and I've cleaned it, and I'll let it dry. Let it just passivate the stainless overnight, just to feel better about the inside of the keg.
Yeah.
And I'll come back to that keg, and that keg still smells pretty hoppy, right? There's still a lot of stuff going on. But yeah, I've yet to, I'll put a lager in there next, and I won't taste any difference, right? I'm not going to see or taste anything. So, I think that those things are very light and subtle, but to the point of, impacting the beer. I mean, it's super cool question, right? And that's a cool question to try to piece together.
Yeah, this was one that Brian was curious about, and he actually designed a very interesting experiment. We're not going to get too deep into it. I'm sure we'll talk about it on another episode in the future. But where he basically had hop CO2 that he used for, I believe he used it for carbonating or something like that, versus clean, quote unquote, clean CO2, and it didn't make a difference. I mean, I just, if that doesn't make a difference, I'm really highly doubtful that your beer is going to absorb the flavors from the air, essentially, that are in that keg that you are actually pushing out of the keg as you're filling that beer. I could see again, our mind is a weird thing. If you know that what was in that keg was CO2 that had vanilla and chocolate in it, I could see your mind tricking you and making you think that you're tasting vanilla and chocolate in your pale ale, or we're completely wrong and there actually was those notes in there. Your guess is as good as mine at this point. I just haven't experienced that. So
yeah.
Next question comes from David Shell. He says, I've been hearing a lot about hop bite and have tasted it in some of my beers. I hope you can take the time to explain what it is and how to prevent it. Thanks so much for what you do for the home brewing community. Well, thank you for the question, David.
Well, as someone who's definitely made a fair share of hazy IPAs or IPAs or just use hops in general, I've definitely tasted this. I think what's interesting about the flavor, the hop bite, I think we'll kind of come to the hop bite, not hop bitterness and hop bite, something other that comes from the hops. Taste a lot more on the commercial side for beers that are hazy, right? And I think there's a common knowledge or a common phrase, hazy IPAs are that low bitterness. I'm like, I completely disagree. I find many hazy IPAs to be very bitter, and this is this negative kind of grating astringent flavor, which we'll just say is hop bite.
Yeah.
And for me, I find that those are, sometimes they go away. If it's very fresh, right, and honestly, the freshest beer you're going to taste is your own home brew, right? That's the freshest product, and so you're tasting it in a place that's nowhere near where the commercial guys are even at. Commercial beer, it takes a few weeks, maybe a week to ferment, and then a week to stabilize, and then it's going to get packaged, and then it'll be 2 weeks before you taste it out of the can. So your home brew may, it will evolve, right? In a couple of weeks, it'll be a little less that bitterness, that hop bite. How I avoid it in my own brewing is to really pick two things. One is when you add the hops, and then which strains of hops you use. So when you add the hops, for me, to make a really hoppy beer, if their goal is to make a hoppy beer, which is why you would buy those expensive hops to begin with, is to put them in the beer, right? Is to use a very deft hand in both the late edition, the Whirlpool edition, and then the dry hop edition. I see a lot of professional brewers, and I won't name names, but a lot of these guys, they'll produce basically a bland blank wort and then just dry hop the hell out of it.
Yeah.
And they're not adding a lot of Whirlpool. And we've mentioned Scott Janish before. He's looking at the data and looking at the chemical analysis of these beers. It helps a lot to put Whirlpool hops in. The whole flavor is going to carry over. And this makes sense. If you had not dry hopped the beer and you only added hops at the end, you get a lot of hop aroma, hop flavor. And then that vegetable matter stays back in the kettle and doesn't go into the fermenter.
Yeah.
Versus dry hopping is that. And then the second thing I'll say about strains is, right now we're kind of in I would call a renaissance of hops. We can have any hop we want. It can be shipped anywhere across the planet, and you can make virtually any flavor you want. Right?
Yeah, it's amazing.
The problem is that we don't understand Idaho 7 like we understand Cascade.
Yeah.
Right? It's not grown the same way. There's a lot of speciality, and it gets down to lots and crops and everything. So I would say I would pick maybe 5 hops that you really want to focus on, and then try using beers with those hops and put them in at different times in the beer process and then different rates, right?
Yeah.
I kind of stick to ounces per gallons of hops, right? I try not to exceed that, and then that becomes like 7 pounds per barrel, or 7 or 8. Because you go over that in your entire beer, I just think you're gonna have negative consequences. But it can also be that one hop is providing 80% of that hop bite bitterness. So you kind of have to play around. That's kind of my heuristics I've developed. So
yeah, I think your heuristics are good. That all makes sense to me. Correct me if I'm wrong. Hop bite is the same thing that people refer to as hop burn, right?
I consider those the same thing, and I think that's the polyphenol content.
Yes,
it's the vegetal content. It's not. I can't pinpoint what it is in the beer, but it's basically it's the negative part of it, and it's not hop bitterness. It is not alpha acid bitterness.
That's right.
That's the most important thing. Yeah,
yeah. So my experience with that is that it's more astringency, because I associate the fuzziness that I get on my tongue, which people refer to as hop bite or hop burn, as astringency. I mean, that is exactly what I get when I drink a nice dark black tea. It's very good.
Exactly.
I like it. But I don't like it in my beer. It's one of the things that I don't like about hazy IPA. A good one doesn't have that, in my opinion.
Exactly.
I have opened cans of, expensive, hard to find whale type of hazy IPA, and the first thing that happens, I put it on my tongue and I get that fuzzy, like numbing sensation, which, hey, if that's your gig, go for it. I don't care. But that is not something that I like. I want the exact opposite. I want crisp, on my palate, and I taste malt and hops. That's all I want. So yeah, how do you get rid of it? I think what you said, Andy, is key. Is you just don't overdo the hops, or it could just be that your beer is so young that those polyphenols, which I believe are responsible for causing that, they just haven't precipitated out yet. They haven't dropped to the bottom of your keg. So give it a little bit more time. I have actually, New England IPA, hazy IPA are known for being best fresh. I think freshness means like 2 weeks out. You don't want to keg it and be drinking a what tastes like you're biting into a hop cone. So
I've probably mentioned it on the past, but one of my favorite commercial breweries is called Modern Times. They're in California, and I've never had an issue with their beers in terms of the hop bite. But I will say, even if we're getting the beer fresh, which is usually easy because it's around here, is that those cans can actually taste better 3 weeks out from freshness, 3 to 4 weeks out. They're actually evolving in the right direction. So they're doing two things well. One is not having a hop bite, and second is actually kind of getting a stabilized flavor, which is super amazing, super fascinating. But just give it some time, and I would look at your process flow. So,
Yep. There you go.
So next question, Trevor Mack asks, I've been exploring ways to minimize cold side oxidation and have a good success with transferring to a purge keg. What I'd like to find as a solution to the next is how to best add a clarifier like gelatin without exposing my beer to oxygen. Some issues I see are the gelatin hydrated in water will have dissolved oxygen, and adding the solution to the primary fermenter would splash it up. You could add something like a 0O2 dry hopper purged with CO2 prior to dropping it into the fermenter. I have a buddy who's experimenting with using a syringe and a duotite disconnect on the fermenter to push the gelatin mixture in without opening the top of the fermenter or a purge keg. Thoughts and ideas would be appreciated.
So, Trevor, both of those ideas are what I would have suggested. But I absolutely understand the concern, and it's one of the reasons that when I'm making hoppier beers that I don't necessarily find them with gelatin as often these days, is because I want to avoid oxygen exposure as much as possible. And so there are techniques, like you mentioned. I believe Brewers Hardware actually sells a dry hopper that you could, if you wanted to, put your gelatin mixture in, and then it will, the CO2 is going to run up through this little small vessel. And again, it's going to exchange that oxygen that's in there for CO2. It'll actually bubble through your liquid, and then you open up a butterfly valve, and it'll drop that gas or the clarifying, the fining agent, the gelatin or whatever it is you're using, into the beer. I think that's an excellent way to do it. It's not the cheapest way. A couple years ago, a very clever homebrewer sent me an email of this really simple but elegant thing that he rigged up using a water bottle. Classic, wasteful water bottle. But what he would do, basically, he had one of those ball lock, I don't even know what they're called, but it's like a little ball lock thing you can screw onto a water bottle, and you can quickly carbonate, samples of beer or whatever. And so he had one of those, and he would put his gelatin mixture into this water bottle. He would squeeze all of the air out as much as he could, because it's easy to squeeze the air out of these water bottles. He'd put the little ball lock thing on there, pump it full of gas, and he would overpressurize it, the gas in it, right? And then he'd flip it upside down and then connect a small piece of tube from the ball lock thing onto his fermenter. And then as soon as he would put it on the fermenter, the overpressurized CO2 would blast the gelatin fining agent into the fermenter with what I imagine would be very little, if any, oxygen, because he squeezed most of it out. So a really clever and incredibly simple way to avoid oxygen exposure while you're, fining with gelatin or again with whatever else you're putting in your beer post cold crashing.
Yeah, and I think the other part of the removing oxygen, I mean, if you boil that gelatin, the water before adding gelatin, you're going to get rid of a lot of the oxygen. So I would be less concerned there. I think the syringe thing is something I've been doing. What I do now, if I need the beer to be a little clearer, I tend to not add as many things in the experiments. I try to pick and choose what I add just so it's as plain a substrate as possible. When I want the clarification, I will add the Biofine Clear. And what I do is if the beer's in the keg, the beer is clean, the beer's ready to be packaged, the keg is clean and fully purged CO2. I will open the gas in with a disconnect, and so that gas will come out, and then I'll take a syringe of measured out 5 milliliters of the Biofine Clear, and then I will push it down not the gas in, the liquid out line. I will push it out the liquid out line, and I will then push it down. So what will happen is now that's mostly at the bottom of the keg, but it's in the line too. Now what's going to chase that is beer, right? So it's going to be very well mixed in solution without having to open the lid, and I think that is the really good solution for at least the kegging. And the fermenter side, I mean, exactly right. If you can have either the TC valve or some type of port that you can open up and squeeze stuff into, I think that's exactly what you want to do.
Yeah, absolutely. So next question comes from Ben Heck, who's from the Bay Area here in California. He says, I'm devising my own little water experiment and was wondering if you guys could give me any input. I was reading a presentation from Sierra Nevada where they recommended metal concentrations in wort to limit off flavors and oxidation. Being the nut that I am, welcome to the club, Ben, I'm planning on sending some samples into a lab to see what my levels are. The plan is to send in a sample of my tap water after Campton addition, but before adding salts, to check my normal mineral levels and determine if Campton is removing my chloramine. I will then be sending in a sample of my wort post-boil, but before yeast pitch. This will be analyzed for the typical brewer water profile from Ward Labs, plus copper, zinc, and manganese. I'm curious to see if my salt additions actually carry over into the wort at the concentrations predicted by Brü water. I'm thinking of taking the sample after adding yeast nutrient, since that's my normal process, and to see if my yeast nutrient addition contributes to potentially being over those recommended limits. I'm curious if you think any particular type of beer would be best for this experiment. My initial thought is hazy IPA, since that seems to be affected by oxidation the most. Any thoughts or input would be great.
Yeah, this is a super cool idea. And It reminds me of someone, a friend of mine, his name's Jason. He was a home brewer out here, and then he moved to Florida to open up a brewery called Calusa. And he actually did a similar thing where he took his wort at different stages and got mineral content. And what was amazing was the drastic changes in mineral content from the things you described, the things you're looking at. It's not, the spreadsheet's great. Brewed Water, one of my favorite open source spreadsheets for water chemistry, production, everything. It's only going to do so much, and you'll find out that your base malt's going to affect kind of what mineral content, because base malt has mineral content, right? Everything you're adding has mineral content, and so it just changes drastically, and it's very hard. It'll be hard to predict actually what you're going to get. Their measurements will be everything, but I like this idea because it'll really kind of, it's one of these things. It almost sounds like you want to troubleshoot. You're trying to find the problem, but just to know and to say, hey, this comes up, this goes down. It's super fascinating, and maybe it'll show you. You could add more chlorine or you could add more, some chloride or sulfate, and bump it up more to see you're not at a limit. I would say the better limit, the free limit is to do it yourself and add enough so you can taste it and say, okay, I added too much.
Yeah.
But this idea of kind of following your water along the way is very cool. And just to make sure, like I said, if it's more of a troubleshooting thing, like let's say you had a bunch of beers and a string of them had a bunch of, phenols at the end, and it wasn't because of yeast, it was definitely from water. You find that maybe your water provider does a little too much chloramine, in certain months, right?
Yeah.
And then I should be adding more Camden to offset that chloramine or something like that. And so it's a very cool experiment. I mean, I'm going to say it's not going to be a cheap one, but it sounds like a super fun one to begin with. So I like it.
Yeah, nut that you are, Ben. These are the types of things that I think all of us at Brulosophy absolutely love. So Ben did tell me he's going to report back when he's done with this. I emailed him saying how cool this was. I remember a few years ago, somebody got the brilliant idea, I say that as I'm rolling my eyes, to send in samples of popular hazy IPA to Ward Labs and have them do their water profile test. And I remember talking about this with a buddy of mine. At first I was like, oh, that's a cool idea to get what their water profile is. And my buddy was like, they're not getting the water profile. They're getting the beer profile, which is going to be absolutely will be different than the water profile. So it's I feel like what Ben's doing is he's going about this the right way based on the water that he's using. And this is why on every article where we share a recipe, we put the our water profile, the ion levels. It's not, we're not telling you what we're adding, because my water is different than Andy's water, is different than Malcolm's water, is different than, Cade's water. So if you have the ion levels, then you can adjust from your starting water, whatever you're using, you can adjust that to fit it, to make it the same or similar. But if I told you that I added, 6 grams of calcium chloride and 15 grams of gypsum for your water, you might be thinking that's nuts. For me, that gets me right into my IPA range, Yeah. So it's just the way that Ben is doing this is very individualized. It is going to be specific to his water that he has, and I think you're going about doing it the right way, Ben. The one thing I think you want to be careful about, obviously, is if you think you have chloramine, wonderful, but I would want to get the straight water tested before I did anything else, because I would want to know what my chlorine and chloramine levels are. And then the other thing, call your water district and make sure that your water is consistent. I can tell you where I live, I'm lucky about 9 months out of the year because I have really good surface water. So it's clean. It's almost Pilsen like. Well, right now, if I were to go out into my garage and whip together a batch of Star Sand solution, within about 2 days, it's going to be milky white. That's because my water station is currently off. They go offline a couple of times a year for a month or so, and that's the case. And so my water profile changes significantly. I have a very cheap but super handy TDS meter, total dissolved solids meter, that I will use just to test where my water is coming from, because it's one of two places. Right now, if I were to go test it, it'd read about 189, between 189 and 250 ppm of total dissolved solids. That is fine. I still can make good beer. My chlorine levels, they thankfully don't use chloramine. Chlorine levels are super low. I just use a little PBM to knock that out. But if I go, during the other times of the year and I measure my total dissolved solids, I'm in the 23 to 25 ppm range consistently. So that is a significantly different water profile. So I do different things depending on the water I'm getting. And that's what you want to do. So those are my points that I wanted to make. I love the way you're going about doing this though, Ben.
Yeah. And for me, I just use RO from the store. So I'm always I'm never worried about it. And that, of course, that water comes from the water district that I live in. So I call them and talk to them, and the water is pretty stable here, but it is used chloramine. So fortunately, those systems, the RO system I use is stripping everything out, and I've never had a problem. So it's good. It's a good check, but it's fun little experiment. I'm looking forward to the results.
So am I, and I just think water is such an important aspect of brewing that thankfully people are focusing on now. I certainly was one who didn't. It took me years to get on board with it, but boy, you get your water under control and your beer will improve. I promise you, this is not an infomercial. This is free information. Mind your water. All right, Andy, final question for the episode.
All right, Josh Edgar with a question regarding using naturally produced CO2 to purge kegs. I ferment in plastic buckets that can't hold enough pressure to push out a keg worth of sanitizer. So instead, I would be sanitizing a keg, dumping out the sanitizer, then hooking it up to it sounds like your method. It's attached to my airlock, so the CO2 goes into the keg, build up pressure, leaves the gas port, which has a blow-off tube attached to it. Do you guys see any obvious problems with doing it this way? My thoughts were that through the oxygen consumption, fermentation, and dilution by the CO2 produced, by the time the fermentation's done, there should be negligible amount of oxygen in the keg. Then I fill that with that I fill from the fermenter. Does this check out, or do you think there's too much oxygen to begin with, and this functional extension of my headspace is that all I get was consumed or diluted enough, and that I'm actually at higher risk for oxidation because of this technique?
Great question, Josh. The first thing I want to say, though, is that he started off his question with, I ferment in plastic buckets that can't hold enough pressure to push out a keg worth of sanitizer. Yes, it can. Unless you are using a plastic bucket that doesn't have a lid that seals well, you absolutely can push out. I've done it. I tested it out. It will hold more than enough pressure to push out a keg's worth of sanitizer. So unless you have a completely different, gear setup than I messed around with, the trick, I think what one person emailed me who uses buckets for this same exact method, and it works for him. He said, every time I do it, my airlock pops out of the hole on the top of the bucket. Well, that will happen. So the trick is very simple. Is you take two bungs, right? Take two of your stoppers, shove one all the way up to the base of the bottom of your airlock, and then put it into the, like you normally would, put it into the hole on your lid of your bucket, and then take another one of those bungs and pop it on the bottom of the whatever's sticking out of the bottom of the lid, and it will sandwich the lid and make a really tight seal. Actually, more than enough to keep the airlock from popping out of that lid. So there's that. Now, to answer your question, do I think that doing the route that you're doing, just pushing the naturally produced CO2 into an empty sanitized keg, as opposed to pushing out sanitizer, do I think that is going to decrease the risk of cold side oxidation? 100% absolutely, I think it will. And there's reasons for that. We know that a lot of people have experienced, who don't purge kegs at all, that if you rack from the bottom of the keg up, yes, and you do it gently and there's not splashing, you will likely push out the good majority of the oxygen that's in there. And there's a good chance that even though there's mixing of gases, that little layer of CO2, that because of the agitation of beer moving from one vessel to another, that there will be some CO2 on there that helps to kind of protect the top of that beer. If you are, to me at least, you are making things even better if you are pushing that CO2 into the keg, even if you're not pushing out Star San or sanitizer. As long as you're pushing it in there, you are still going to rid that keg of a ton of oxygen, especially if, and this is the trick in my opinion, you connect the gas line or from your fermentation vessel. If you connect that gas to your liquid disconnect on your keg, now that CO2 is going to the bottom of the keg, and it's gas is mixed, yes, but it's still heavier than oxygen. It will gently push, air out, and I think you're going to get rid of probably the majority, if not all, of the oxygen in there, because you are producing, 40 pounds plus of CO2 during fermentation. I mean, a lot of CO2 is getting produced. So this could be measured with a DO meter or an oxygen meter. We don't have one. I don't have one, but I do think it would be very interesting to test that theory out.
Yeah, this is cool because I never thought, buckets, I don't use buckets as much as I used to, right? And I think people that are evolving in brewing, they tend to not to go to buckets, but buckets are still super useful, super flexible and inexpensive, right? And it's cool to think about, okay, what can I do to minimize oxygen? Because, you might be in buckets, but I want to start kegging, and you're kind of in this kind of in-between space. And so, but like we said, because it's, I would say, one of the consistent things we come back to with every experiment that deals with cold side oxidation is get the oxygen out of your beer, right? Get it out, right? And so you need techniques, you need mechanisms to do it, and this is super cool. I tend to just have these. I have the Delta fermenters, and I have the corny kegs, and I do is I just push the sanitizer out with CO2, right? And it's wasteful, but I don't have enough storage for CO2 to keep it around the natural stuff. But it's good to try it with a bucket, and you can play around with it, right? And I'm sure the beer will be better for it.
Yeah, that's my thing. And again, just to reiterate, we're talking about water chemistry being important. Another thing that I was late to the game on, but I'm absolute advocate for now, is making sure you keep your beer unexposed to oxygen, or as much as possible. So anything you can do, Josh, to do that, do it. And if you don't think you can push sanitizer out of your keg, which I'm pretty certain you can, then do what you're doing. I think you are, at the very least, you're reducing your risk. I do not believe you are increasing it in the slightest. Well, Andy, that is a wrap on our 210th episode. I can't believe we've recorded 210 episodes at this point. If you consider the fact each of these episodes averages, about an hour and 6 minutes, that is a lot of talking. How cool that we get to do this, man.
Yeah, no, and this has been fun. This one's good. I love, like I said at the beginning, I love answering these questions because we get to send something out to the world in terms of our experiments or our BIYs or our short and shotties, and then those get ruminated on and thrown around, and then they come back to us in this new way that we never thought about before. And that's the whole point of doing this. That's the whole point of playing this game, is to learn and grow and find new things to worry about. And look, I think we just answered about 10 questions. And we have 3 new experiments to do. So let's go.
There you go, man. perfect point. I couldn't agree more. If there is anything at all that you'd like for us to address in a future Brü A episode, please send your questions to feedback@brulosophy.com and make sure to indicate it's for Brü A in the subject line. We'll be sure to add it to the list. And I say this every Brü A episode. You don't have to just ask us about brewing stuff. We like talking about other stuff as well. So I'll give you some hints on things that I'm curious about lately. I've been smoking a lot of food. I picked up a pellet smoker. You can make fun of me for that if you want. I know people like to harp on different types of smokers. I love it. I use it for everything now. I'm also kind of into the whole crypto thing. So if you have questions about that, I'd be happy to. Andy, do you have anything else, just non-brewing stuff people can ask you about?
I'm so wired into brewing these days. I started doing some video editing for my homebrew club because we taped some videos at a camp out. So any video tips, any audio tips, that's good. What else? I don't know. I know I'm so ingrained in brewing, but cooking. Let's talk about cooking. Send me your favorite chicken recipe and let's talk about how to roast your favorite chicken. Actually, it's Thanksgiving now, right? So let's talk about how you're going to cook your turkey.
Yeah, that's. I'll tell you that I'll be using my smoker for all of that.
I'll be using this smoker. Yeah.
So, all right. Don't forget to check out the Brü Lab, a podcast where host Kate Job takes you into the lab with brewing professionals to discuss the fascinating work they've done on our favorite beverage. And make sure to head to brulosophy.com to read up on all of the fun beer and brewing stuff we're up to. The Brulosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brulosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brulosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brulosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it soothes my throat. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman, no.